Hey everyone, welcome to Current Events by Theater Equity Revolution. I'm Ana Sofia Villanueva, and I'm a theater arts producer, director, writer, and equity specialist, as well as the executive producer of this podcast. Sophie Payton is your host. Sophie is a director, producer, and community organizer who works at the intersection of intergenerational theater, grassroots organizing, and anti-oppression work. In this podcast you are listening to, Sophie will be discussing current events and how they relate to the theater industry, as well as share resources and ways to participate as artist activists. If you like our content, please subscribe, follow, or leave us a comment. We can be found on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok by searching for Theater Equity Revolution. For more in-depth feedback, please feel free to send us an email at theaterequityrevolution@gmail.com. In today's episode, Sophie will be discussing her research on the National Endowment for the Arts, the new NEA restrictions and challenges it's facing with the current administration, and of course, her point of views on the matter. Sophie, please take it away.
Thank you, Anna Sophia. This is a huge topic. I really tried to move into researching the NEA kind of from like a novice perspective, really from the place of like, what is the NEA? How did it exist? How did it start? What does it do? All of that. And of course, a lot of this was spurred by the NEA being in the news a lot over the past 2 or 3 months and why it's been in the news so much over the past couple months and everything that's going on. So I really wanted to kind of walk you through that context specifically, some of the things I've learned, some of the things I've discovered. It is a lot. Like, this is a huge national agency. There's a lot going on. I'll sort of give you that context, and then I'll share with you what I think we should do about all of this. So stay with me. So NEA history, let's start there. What is this? When did it come about? The first part of this is the National Council of the Arts. The council was established through the National Arts and Cultural Development Act in 1964. This was a full year before the NEA was created by Congress. Some of the folks that President Lyndon Johnson at the time included in this council were folks like Ralph Ellison, Gregory Peck, Leonard Bernstein, Agnes DeMille, and others. A year later, the National Endowment for the Arts is created. 1965, this is an act of Congress signed by President Johnson. It was the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act of 1965. This is what established the National Endowment for the Arts. This piece of legislation was a big part of President Johnson's Great Society plan. He had this plan at the time and this legislative agenda that promoted a series of domestic programs that were aimed at eliminating poverty, reducing racial injustice, expanding social welfare in the country, many of the very programs that the current administration is challenging and trying to cut today. President Johnson is also a key player in the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and various other legislation in the late 1960s. I will say he's not an amazing leader. He's not a perfect dude. He didn't somehow solve everything with this Great Society plan. Like, during his presidency, he definitely supported escalation and bombings in the Vietnam War. He engaged the FBI and CIA in surveillance and efforts to undermine anti-war activists, as well as Martin Luther King Jr. That being said, he did push for a pretty progressive legislative agenda and liberal agenda at the time. This National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act, this is what establishes our NEA. It also establishes the NCA, the National Council on the Arts. This is the council from that year before. They carried it over. A 26-citizen council that serves as advisors to the NEA. So we have the National Council on the Arts, and we've got the National Endowment for the Arts. So how does the president and administration fit into this? Let's talk governance. How are decisions made? I pulled this straight from Wikipedia. The NEA is governed by a chairman. The chairman's nominated by the president to a 4-year term and is subject to congressional confirmation. The NEA's advisory committee, this National Council on the Arts, advises the chairman on policies and programs, also reviews grant applications, fundraising guidelines, leadership initiatives, etc. This is straight from the About Us section on the National Council for the Arts website. The council advises the chairman on agency policies and programs, and the chairman also chairs the council. So the chairman reviews and makes recommendations for the chairman on applications and initiatives. It's a little sus, but let's break down the council. The council is now comprised of 25 members. There are 18 who are appointed by the president. That's a lot. There are 6 who are ex officio non-voting members, who are members of Congress, who are appointed in sort of this ratio. 2 of them are appointed by the Speaker of the House. 1 is appointed by the Minority Leader of the House, 2 by the Senate Majority Leader, and 1 by the Minority Leader. The extra person is the chairperson of the NEA, who also serves on the council. That gives us our 25. Not gonna lie, in unpacking this a little bit, I feel a little worried. Like, there's not a lot of accountability here, especially when the president is untrustworthy and Congress has given up much of its power and authority and control like we've seen. I started to get worried about the checks and balances here. It made me question, is the NEA functioning like a nonprofit? Is this the kind of system where we make decisions as if like the artistic director is also the president of the board? Like, where is the accountability here? So I dug a little deeper. Currently, there are 18 members of the National Council for the Arts, and 6 of them, like I said, serve in this non-voting capacity. Although members of the council are appointed by the president, they are approved by the Senate, and they're approved for 6-year staggered terms. So there is some intention to create this in a way that is somewhat bipartisan, right? There are 6 years, so they're theoretically past a typical presidential term. So who's making these decisions now? Like literally right now. All of the current NEA members were appointed by Biden or Obama. Seriously, all of them. Council members continue to serve even after their terms expire until a replacement is confirmed by the Senate. The oldest folks were confirmed in 2013. The newest were confirmed in 2022. All of them are from Biden or Obama administrations. And also, 3 of the 6 non-voting members are currently empty. These are supposed to be appointed by folks in Congress. So Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, and Mike Johnson all haven't put forth a rep for this council. And I'm so surprised these assholes didn't prioritize this. Realistically, what we have is a council that is intended to be bipartisan, where half of the representatives from Congress are not being currently filled. So we're missing perspectives, we're missing voices from a system that is supposed to be functioning in a more equitable way. The current chair, the other decision maker involved here, was Maria Rosario Jackson, who, I'm not going to lie, seemed pretty chill. But unfortunately, she resigned on January 20th. So cool. So not entirely sure. I kind of tried to do some digging, but it seems like the position's open right now. Until the Senate confirms a new chair, no one is in this position of power. And the chair really matters. In doing this digging on accountability and the internal systems, there's not a lot there. There's not a lot of checks and balances inside of the system with the chairman heading the council and the NEA. So who the chair is really fucking matters here. So let's talk about what the NEA even does. What are they responsible for? The NEA is, quote, dedicated to supporting excellence in the arts, both new and established, bringing the arts to all Americans, and providing leadership in arts education, end quote. That is straight from their website. What does that mean? They give money. They give grants. They give lots of money. That's the primary purpose. Between 1965, when the endowment was established, and 2008, $5 billion were given to the arts in this country. Money that's designated for the NEA roughly comes to around $130 million a year or so over those years. It's been as low as about 90 million. It's got as high as like 180 million. Biden had already slotted to up the budget to 200 million in fiscal year 2025. About 80% of the NEA's budget is awarded in grant money. About 40% of that 80% goes to state arts agencies. 60% goes to orgs and individuals. So that's who they're serving. They're giving money to arts projects, national initiatives, partnership agreements, projects in arts and communities, education, dance, design, literature, theater, music, visual art, museums, etc. A huge part of this, the 40%, is that the state arts agencies and regional arts organizations are the NEA's primary partner in serving Americans through the arts. There's 6 major regional arts councils, kind of for each part of the country. A couple examples, there's like one for Arts Midwest, there's one for the Creative West, South Arts, Mid-Atlantic Arts, et cetera, et cetera. These are some of like the big houses that take this NEA money and then distribute it down to people in our community. For example, I live in Minnesota. In Minnesota, if you live in Minnesota, you've maybe heard of the Minnesota State Arts Board. This is the group that is funded by the NEA in our state. They then fund regional arts councils, such as, if you've heard of MRAC, the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, which is the primary arts council for the Twin Cities. So these are the regional and state organizations who determine where the money goes. In terms of scope, how much money is actually going to the arts from our federal budget and tax dollars? So the NEA receives 0.004% of the total annual US budget. That is less than half of 1/10 of a percentage point. A teeny tiny amount. Not even 1 percentage point. Not even half of 1 percentage point. It is such a tiny amount that ends up going to the NEA. And despite this, the NEA has had a lot of threats. So this is not new. The NEA has had many threats before, several over the past many decades, and definitely since its inception. The first that I found was in the 1980s. Reagan was a big proponent of wanting to abolish the NEA over the first 3 years of his presidency. Ultimately, he did abandon this after getting feedback from his allies that this is not a very popular opinion. Jumping forward to 1989, this was the Piss Christ controversy. The controversy was around an artist that had NEA funding who ended up making a piece of art called Piss Christ. This was a photograph that depicted a very small plastic crucifix that was submerged in a small glass tank of the artist's urine. Fired a lot of controversy. People got pretty mad. There's a lot of public pushback, and it spurred a big congressional debate about the appropriations of the NEA in general. It inspired a lot of like new restrictions that were wanted around content that was NEA supported work, their grant making policies, but ultimately the efforts to defund the NEA at this time failed. Why? Well, I like to think in some ways it was because our government was working. So a Democrat and Republican from Congress worked together to make a bipartisan bill that ended up saving funding for the NEA. So across party lines, they decided that not only was this something that was needed, but they wanted to designate more money to state arts councils so that they continue to increase the diversity on their review panels so that things like this maybe wouldn't happen again. Either way, while I disagree with some of the things, the NEA survived this controversy. Just a year later, the NEA 4, this was a group of 4 artists who had NEA grant-funded work that got rescinded due to the subject matter. This went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1993. This is the National Endowment for the Arts versus Finley. The artists eventually won their money back because the courts deemed that the NEA chairperson is the one who's responsible for determining artistic merit and criteria. Since these artists were already granted their money, they got their money back. Thank you, Supreme Court, for standing by artists. Jumping forward, 1995. Cue House Speaker the shitty Newt Gingrich. He begins to instigate similar claims. The NEA gives money to offensive art, it's wasteful, it's elitist, it should be eliminated. Some cuts were made to the NEA at this time, but there was also major lobbying efforts that were launched in support of the arts, and ultimately, Gingrich failed too. The country's priorities shifted at this time, and the NEA remained supported and funded. Jumping forward from there, 2017, Trump's first administration. He also tried to write the NEA out of the budget, but Congress approved a budget with funding. There was actually a lot of congressional Republicans at the time who spoke up and were really vocal about not supporting these efforts. Trump tried again in 2018, but Congress kept funding the NEA. So where are we now? Like, what's going on? The NEA has been in the news a lot recently, and this is because in February of this year, the NEA imposed restrictions on federal grant applications to comply with President Trump's executive orders, which bars federal funding for programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or used to, quote, promote gender ideology, end quote. And as I was digging through the application, it seems like every applicant has to sign part 1 of these guidelines and legal requirements. It listed as this, and this is directly from the arts.gov page. Quote, by signing and submitting its application form on grants.gov, the applicant certifies that it is in compliance with the statutes outlined below and all related National Endowment for the Arts regulations, as well as all applicable executive orders, and that it will maintain records and submit the reports that are necessary to determine its compliance, end quote. So as of February this year, the NEA is requiring you to sign away your compliance. I really want to note how much is changing and how much has been happening in such a short amount of time, even if it's overwhelming, even if it's hard to comprehend. I'll be honest, it was overwhelming for me when I started pulling all of this together and realizing how much has happened. So I'm going to walk through a timeline of the past 2 to 3 months of everything that's happened in relation to the NEA. I encourage you, please try to tend to your nervous system and stay present with this info, even if it feels scary. I'm going to talk about what's happening. I'll try and go slow. It's going to be a lot of dates and timelines, but then we'll break it down about what we should do in the greater context. So bear with me. January 22nd, Trump rescinds Biden's executive order, dissolving the Committee on the Arts and Humanities. This is the committee who's in charge of advising the president on cultural policy issues. Before Trump's first term, this committee had existed under both Democratic and Republican administrations since 1982. January 27th, the White House sends a memo freezing all federal grants and loans. January 29th, the White House rescinds this memo, but looming threats on federal funding sources for individuals and organizations still remain. February 6th, just about a week later, the NEA announced that it's canceling the Challenge America grant program and says that there are new eligibility guidelines incoming. A day later, February 7th, Trump removes board members of the Kennedy Center. February 10th, the NEA posts their new guidelines, including this assurance of compliance document. This is the attempt to enforce all grantees to comply with all applicable executive orders. including restricting diversity, equity, and inclusion programming and, quote, gender ideology, end quote. 2 days later, February 12th, Trump's elected chairman of the Kennedy Center. Pushback begins and continues, and things have progressed since this first announcement over 2 months ago. There was over 460 kind of famous celebrity artists who submitted a letter asking the NEA to reverse its changes. There's been various other outspoken acts of protest and resistance to these changes from artists and institutions. On March 6th, Rhode Island Latino Arts, the Theater Offensive, National Queer Theater, and the Theater Communications Group, along with the ACLU, sued the NEA to challenge the requirement to not promote, quote, gender ideology to apply for NEA grants. A day later, the National Endowment for the Arts agrees to remove the requirement that applicants will certify that they will not promote gender ideology by the March grant deadline. They also said they will keep it that way while the lawsuit continues. A week later, Trump signs an executive order calling for the elimination of federal agencies he labels as unnecessary. This includes the Institute of Museum and Library Services. March 31st, the Institute of Museum and Library Services is placed on administrative leave. Just for context, this is kind of the version of the NEA for museums and libraries nationwide. This is like the equivalent of like their federal agency and funding source. April 3rd, the Trump administration cancels millions of dollars in previously awarded federal humanities grants to arts and culture organizations. They literally rescind the money. Even after saying on January 29th, they're not going to freeze all federal funds and grants, they take the money away anyway. There has been a near constant stream of new threats to arts and culture occurring on almost a daily basis, and it can feel really hard to pinpoint what's most concerning. So where are we now? I'm going to give you some context on the lawsuit. A lot of this is pulled from TCG, the Theater Communications Group. It's also pulled from the ACLU, who's fighting this lawsuit on behalf of TCG and the other co-plaintiffs involved. The ACLU appeared in federal court, arguing that a restriction from the National Endowment for the Arts on funding projects that promote, quote, gender ideology, end quote, that this violates the First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment of the Administrative Procedural Act. Basically, this is from an ACLU attorney. They went into court and said, we are in court today to make sure that the NEA can't pull a bait and switch on arts organizations by allowing them to apply free of restrictions only to disqualify them later. This is specifically from Vera Edelman, a senior staff attorney at the ACLU. Basically, they're fighting in court to make sure that money that's designated and granted to arts orgs can't be taken away because they're doing work or content that the administration doesn't like or deems diversity, equity, and inclusion. So here's the April 4th update. The federal judge denied this request for preliminary relief. The ACLU-led lawsuit challenged this, but it failed. Although the court did agree that barring NEA funding for projects that promote, quote, gender ideology, end quote, would likely violate the First Amendment, they refused to expressly block the NEA from reimposing these restrictions. I'll break this down. Basically, the court concluded that the NEA is currently in process of determining whether to reimpose the ban, and so the court can't get in the way of the agency's decision-making. Let's back it up. After the lawsuit was filed on March 6th, the NEA temporarily lifts the oppressive requirement on March 7th. The NEA then advises the judge that they're in an internal process of evaluating how these executive orders are going to be implemented. They extend the deadline for grants from March to April 7th, knowing there's going to be a ruling on April 4th, and then the judge denies it to say they don't want to get in the way of the NEA's decision-making. This kind of feels like a scam, right? They challenge the NEA says, we're working on it, and then the courts go, we can't do anything, they're working on it. So that's what we're left with. And of course, the NEA didn't rule out that they could reimpose the same bullshit restriction later. So basically, any future rule or future prohibition could apply retroactively to applicants and organizations who have already submitted. And the NEA decided that they were going to determine their final answer by April 30th, which is 3 weeks after the grant deadline. Cool. Thanks for that. So to reiterate, the ACLU reported that the court ruled it was not going to get in the way of the NEA's decision-making process because the NEA is currently in the process of determining whether to reimpose the ban. So that's where we're left. I do see an upside here. One is that the judge did make it clear that the restriction would likely violate the First Amendment. That's pretty reassuring. So there is another avenue to fight. If this restriction is reimposed by the NEA, it's highly likely that it's going to be unconstitutional. So in the past 2 weeks, on April 7th, a coalition of 21 state attorneys filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration's executive order that called for dismantling multiple federal agencies. April 15th, a White House official tells the press that the Trump administration has prepared a memo for Congress. This memo has plans to eliminate nearly all federal funding for public media. This includes NPR and PBS. So like what's next? What do we do about this? Let's bring it back to the theater industry. TCG listed some next steps during the first week of April. I don't want to sound judgmental or shitty or ungrateful. The advocacy work that TCG in collaboration with the ACLU has been doing is super important work. And also, what TCG listed as next steps were to stay engaged, to read updates, and to reach out to TCG staff to share your experience. Cool. I'm not going to lie. That's very unmotivating. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how I'm supposed to move forward as an engaged artist and activist right now with those steps. These are supposed to be the folks, the theater communications group, who are leading our industry in this country, and their steps are to stay engaged and read updates. So yes, those are true. Those are good things to do. And also, I think we need to do more. Here's what I think we should do. I think we need a multi-pronged approach, and I think we need to fight this on different fronts. And there's 3 areas I think we need to focus in on. So let me break it down for you. 1, there's a social consciousness piece. We need to combat the messaging of why does this even matter? And especially for non-artist folks, why should they even fight for the NEA at all? 2, there's an organizational and industry piece. How do we want to use organizations' platforms and privileges and power and resources right now while federal funding and state agency support is in flux? What can we do and push for at our nonprofit organizations and companies to effectively resist oppressive policies? And 3, there's an artist worker piece. How do we sustain artists right now? Like literally, what do I do? How can we push forward and towards a more equitable theater industry right now? Let me start with number 1, the social consciousness piece. So in my research, I wanted to dig into some of the reasoning and thoughts behind, do we even need the NEA? How do we combat this? What's that perspective? And how do we sway the general public on art support and value? So I found an article from a pretty well-known source called, quote, 10 Good Reasons to Eliminate Funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, end quote. Controversial. And honestly, I do feel a little bit bad spending and selling my attention and algorithm time on this particular source, but I wanted to understand this perspective better. And I also wanted to give an artist lens on it. Does saving the NEA matter at all? And how can we talk about it? I'm going to highlight a few of these 10 good reasons, some of the ones that I found a bit more well-supported or interesting. Their reason number 1, the arts will have more than enough support without the NEA. Interesting point. This could be true, I suppose. So in trying to find some more factual information about this, I found this info from the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. The National Assembly of State Arts Agencies says, and I agree with this, philanthropic giving in the United States is geographically disproportional. I think that's true. Philanthropy is inherently unequal. No surprise there. They also say that rural areas receive only 5.5% of all grant-making money. And this figure is declining over time, with rural areas getting less and less as time goes on. So if we were to move to a solely private funding model for the NEA, the arts would not have enough support. Actually, it seems like leaving this responsibility to the private sector would leave many American communities and their arts spending behind. If we look even before the NEA, in the 1940s and the 1950s, there was a lot of arts funding. Do you know why? We were in a bit of an economic boom. This was post-World War II. There was a lot of funding that was going into supporting the arts. The middle class was expanding. Corporations were giving more to the arts. There was an increased incentive to reduce your taxable income through charitable giving. We don't live in that economy now. We don't live in that world. I'm glad that that happened, but the NEA was created for a reason. It takes a mixture of both public and private funds to realize the full power of arts for Americans. So, okay, reason 1 seems kind of false. The arts will not have more than enough support without the NEA and federal funds. Support would likely become more disproportionate, and specific communities, especially with low-income residents, would likely suffer. So reason 2, this is what they say. The NEA is welfare for cultural elite. Okay, so is the NEA classist? I think that's worth considering. I wouldn't want to save a classist agency. So are they primarily supporting cultural elites? Here's what I found. There's actually a significant percentage of NEA grants that go to those who have fewer opportunities to participate in the arts. So like not really cultural elites, but like 40% of NEA support activities take place in high poverty neighborhoods. 36% go to organizations that reach underserved populations. 33% serves low income audiences. So government arts support does help ensure that rural and low income communities get a share of some of the educational and economic benefits offered by the arts. And also, 30 to 40% of total NEA funding is not a lot. So I don't think this is a totally wrong point. 20 to 30% of the NEA grants do go to large organizations with over $1 to $2 million in their budget. And many of those orgs with that much money in their budget, they often tend to serve cultural elites. I think that's fair, but it's also not the whole truth. The other 2/3 of that NEA funding goes to small and medium-sized organizations. So I think it's partly true. I don't think the NEA is welfare for elites, but I would agree that a little bit more varied distribution would be highly valuable and worth investing in. So their reason for the NEA lowers the quality of American art. I kind of think there's some weight to this criticism. Here's what the article says. The NEA's opponents have it right. Bureaucratic culture is not genuine culture. It was the unsubsidized writers, painters, and musicians who created lasting culture. I don't know, like I kind of agree. I feel like NEA art is rarely the risky good art. Like this is kind of why Piss Christ was so controversial, right? It was super edgy and risky and political. People were pissed that it was funded by federal tax dollars. The article goes on to say, quote, government subsidies can often hurt the quality of art by promoting a new cult of mediocrity. The NEA helps the well-connected and the well-established at the expense of the less sophisticated and possibly more talented outsiders. The NEA thereby reduces the importance of the arts by instead substituting the need to please a third-party government patron. And this drives a wedge between artists and audiences. End quote. They also mention that there's this comparative study in Great Britain that focuses on federally subsidized and unsubsidized artistic work in the country. It notes that government subsidies actually work to reduce choice and diversity in the artistic marketplace by encouraging artists to emulate each other in order to achieve success in the grants process. I think that's kind of true. I feel like I've seen this in grant writing and on grant review panels. Like it doesn't really promote competition for higher quality art or more challenging art. It just promotes competition for more fundable art. And I do think sometimes artists can begin to mimic each other. I don't think that that's wrong. And their last reason I'll share, reason number 10. Funding the NEA disturbs the US tradition of limited government. Considering the current events and the state of things, and the major overstepping with the NEA restrictions in the Trump administration, it is almost laughable for me that this is one of the reasons listed. If you're thinking, is this a good faith argument that the author is making? I will share with you that this article is from the Heritage Foundation. And if you don't know, the Heritage Foundation is a wildly right think tank from the 70s. They significantly influenced policymaking during the Reagan era, and more recently, they're a big contributor and driving force behind Project 2025. I know. But I think it's important to engage with some of the things they're saying. Some of these critiques are really part of our social discourse right now. Even though they wrote this article in 1997 during the Clinton administration, and obviously they have a very biased agenda here, that's dated, I think it's worth engaging with. A lot has changed in the arts industry since this was written. And it's so abundantly clear that our arts industry is not thriving right now, especially post-pandemic. But even before that, arts funding has been going down and arts business models have been failing for the past 2 decades. So I think it's worth considering some of these perspectives and some of these criticisms. Some are valid. And also my prevailing feeling is that funding from the federal government in support to the arts is a net good thing, even if it's problematic and imperfect. So many people, even artists in the field, don't know how arts are funded or what this process entails to receive funding. So the social consciousness piece is huge. The NEA helps to close so many gaps in funding and access to the arts that we do need. And also, we need better transparency around this. We need more public discussion and recognition. And there's something we can do to affect the social consciousness piece. So I think we need to think forward. Can we please revise and reform the NEA too? It should cater less to big orgs. And it should support less traditional and classic art that focuses on the dominant culture of white upper middle class and Christian folks. And the NEA should promote and support a wider and more varied range of artist workers. So what can organizations and companies do? Let's look at two, the organizational industry piece. What can we push for at our nonprofit organizations and companies to effectively resist oppressive policies from the federal government? We've seen some efforts. Some theaters are using their platforms publicly to voice their concerns to donors and their supporters about the restrictions that have been imposed. Some theaters are rejecting their NEA grants and saying they're not going to comply with the executive orders. And I'm left wondering, so what happens if no one takes the money from the NEA? Well, I think we should take the money. I think we have to. If we don't, if no one takes the money, if we don't apply for it, if we don't accept it, they will defund us. Don't comply, don't change your content, but make sure your org takes the money and fights back. That's what we need organizations to do right now, to stand up and not let our public arts funding be influenced and devalued by the current administration. Here's a way to fight back. Legal counsel. You have legal counsel on your board or full-time or on an as-needed basis. Fucking use them. This is what they're here for. We need to legally protect artists who want to do radical work right now. And many of these organizations have these resources. TCG, I'm looking at you in this moment. It would be great if you could use some of your resources to support artists fighting these things on a legal basis right now. AEA, the Actors Equity Association, SDC, the Stage Directors and Choreographers Union, you better stand by your artists right now. We know you have these resources. And this goes for theaters too. Many theaters have artistic endowments. If you don't know what an endowment is, it's an aspect of financial freedom and independence. It means that theaters are sitting on a pile of money that they get to invest. Here's a couple examples. The Guthrie has one, Children's Theater Company has one, Steppenwolf, the Alley in Houston, the Public in New York, Actors Theater of Louisville. That is literally just the first 5 seconds of me researching this. So many theaters have endowments. And that's what they're for. They're for financial freedom. In 2023 alone, just looking at Children's Theater Company in Minneapolis, their endowment was around $17 million. Use it. Organizations have to be prepared to take the money and fight back. When we fight back, we set a new standard. We cannot let the NEA become a political and authoritarian tool. We have to support the greater need for federal funding and federal support for arts in our country. I will provide in the resources some links from community-centric fundraising. This is specifically about how you can talk to your donors about funding right now in case you want to dive a little bit deeper. And the third piece, the artist worker piece. What can I do? How do we sustain artists right now? Here's what I'm left with. With all of this info, it's been over 60 years of a history with the NEA. Across Republicans and Democrats, it's survived and sustained. A common theme has always been that funding the NEA, for better or worse, serves a larger public good, even if that larger public good isn't keeping with values or long-term visions of justice. But realistically, government-supported artists and artistic work is generally a good. Not that it's without its flaws, not that it can't be improved upon, but ultimately, it is a good thing. And so here's what I'm wrestling with. After going through all this information and going through all of this research, I feel fucking tired. I feel exhausted by it, honestly. I feel exhausted we have to fight this fight again. I feel exhausted that like artists fucking fought it in the 80s and in the 90s, and now here we are again in the exact same place. And I feel drained and I feel powerless. But when I sit with that, I have to remind myself that there is an intention to overwhelm and there is an intention to make us feel exhausted and disengaged. But we're not powerless. Artists do have power right now. And honestly, just like with the Kennedy Center, when things are getting attacked like the NEA, we know that we're doing something right. There's a reason that there's pushback against the work that we've been trying to move forward. So where does individual artists' power lie right now? Here's what I'll say. I think you need to get your funding and resist and fight back. I think we need to push organizations to do more to support us right now. And I think individual artists and organizations, you have to maintain the same agenda. When safely, do it loudly and get bigger. For individuals who have this power, we need to leverage our organizations. When the government pushes back, use your legal power. Take it to the courts if needed. But we have to support arts and communities that we serve, regardless of the risks and resources right now. Everyone who's involved in this industry, whether you're an individual artist or someone working for a nonprofit arts organization, we have to keep critiquing the NEA. It's not perfect. It's not serving everyone that it needs to be. But we also need to keep supporting the NEA. We have to hold both. It's complex and it's shitty But realistically, we need this agency. And I think the moment right now, what we have to do is hold the complexity of what is best for now, which is resisting with everything that we can what this administration is pushing for. And also, we need to maintain federal funding and federal agencies that support arts and culture in the long term. I think a lot of that power, realistically, lies on organizations and institutions. Those are the ones that have systemic power and pull with the NEA, but artists work at those places. So, what I will challenge you to do is speak up. Make sure your organization knows how you feel and make sure they understand the consequences of what it means to not take this money right now. There are other ways to resist, and there are other ways to support that resistance. In preparing for this episode, here's a lot of things that I was reading and information that I was gathering. I got a lot of sources from arts.gov, from whitehouse.gov, lots of press about budgeting, spending, allocation, things like that. I also researched into Wikipedia, the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies as well. There's some information on YouTube. The ACLU hearings are on there. There's also various information on aclu.org, TCG, American Theater Magazine, Arts News, the New York Times, with a lot of info about the lawsuits, as well as some of the state government pages and attorney general pages too. I've also listed community-centric funding resources. Again, this is a hub for the movement around folks who are trying to get fundraising done in a different way and exploring and discussing new ways that can reduce harm and further social justice in the nonprofit sector. So those are in the sources for you to pass along to organizations as well. Surprise bonus section. So the episode you just heard, Anna Sophia and I recorded on April 16th. That was about a month ago. Today is May 14th. Various things in both of our lives have happened that have delayed some of the process of this episode coming out. And while we were editing the audio and the video and putting everything together, there have been some additional changes that have come through from the NEA. We were getting pretty close to finalizing everything finally, but couldn't let these updates be left out of this episode. So, and also with some of these changes, my perspective and takeaway has changed a bit too. So here are some of the major updates from the past few weeks. The first one is that April 30th decision from the NEA. This was about making that final call on how the racist and sexist executive order is going to be implemented into the grant application process. That deadline has now passed and decisions have been made. So there are no new restrictions that are going to be placed at the application stage for NEA grants, which is good. That compliance piece has not been added back in. Instead, they are allowing the NEA chair to use their discretion at the final stage of the grants approval process for projects that relate to gender identity and LGBTQ+ themes. An attorney from the ACLU of Rhode Island confirms that this information does not eliminate our significant concerns addressed in our lawsuit. TCG, along with the other co-plaintiffs that are represented by the ACLU, continue to challenge the implementation of this executive order and its impact on freedom of expression and federal arts funding. The second update is from May 2nd. It's about 2 weeks ago now. The NEA informed hundreds of arts organizations nationwide that their already accepted grants and grant funding has been withdrawn or terminated. I'm going to link to a Google Doc in the resources that's tracking in real time all the organizations and projects that have been affected in case you're curious who's getting defunded. In the emails that were sent to organizations terminating their funding, the NEA said that a grant may be canceled if, quote, it no longer effectuates the program's goals or agency's priorities. This is that discretion piece that I was talking about with the April 30th decision. The NEA chair can basically say, oh yeah, nope, this project no longer effectuates the agency's priorities, and so no more funding for you. Just a reminder from earlier in the episode, the current chair of the NEA, Maria Rosario Jackson, has resigned, and the new NEA chair has not been confirmed by the Senate. So from what I can tell, there is no current chair, and other NEA staff are stepping into these responsibilities at the moment. For what it's worth, the NEA senior advisor, Mary Ann Carter, ran the May 1st, 2025 public meeting just 2 weeks ago from the National Council on the Arts. So I don't know, maybe she's in charge. I have a lot of concerns about accountability, as I stated before. There has also been mass resignation of NEA staff in the past 2 weeks, including directors who are overseeing grants for dance, design, folk and traditional arts, and theater, as well as the director of the Partnerships Division. And this is the person who oversees the work with state and local arts agencies, one of that primary pieces of funding from the NEA. If you follow national theater at all, like I do, I'm sure your social media feed and your email inbox has been blowing up in the past 2 weeks about all of this and trying to figure out, what do we do next? So, my initial takeaway in this episode was super centered on organizations and around the importance of taking money and resisting now and supporting the NEA in the long run. I do still agree with this approach of holding the now and the future needs and holding them as closely and complexly as we can. But it feels really privileged now to say take the money, especially after these changes from the NEA and having some real consequences come to fruition. Not everyone has the privilege to take the money. Many of the organizations affected by this were small. Not all of them, but many of them have grants for $20,000, $40,000 that were terminated for individual projects or programs that centered around marginalized artists and increasing arts access. And if you don't know, most of the NEA grants are reimbursement based. This means that the theater has to put out that money first and then send in a lot of paperwork back to the NEA to prove the expenses, how it falls into their approved application, and have it all processed before they get any of that money back. So a lot of these companies that had this money terminated, they've already spent this money. They've spent it and now they're not going to get it back. It's super fucked. So these are real life consequences. These are people's jobs and livelihoods. Not everyone can just take the money and fight back. Arts organizations don't all have the same resources and don't all have the same support. And I think it was wrong of me to assume that that was a realistic option for most, especially in light of these escalations of consequences and particularly surrounding artists of color. So I feel differently now. It is institutional funding that we're losing here. It is money that pays for arts education programs and new work productions. It's project-based, it's artist-based funding. This isn't money that's going to new buildings or even really paying utility bills. It is paying for artists to work, and it's paying for their artistic work to be made and to be shared. So arts institutions are in danger. Like, I feel that fear. I don't want to take it lightly or minimize the effect here. But I do want to recognize that it's not new. Like, arts institutions have been in danger for a long time, for decades, honestly. And all of this happening with the NEA only enhances my curiosity and my questions and desire to explore why the industry is failing and why the current business model of theater isn't serving the art form. For real, like, does having arts institutions be diminished or widely reduced financially really stop high quality art and arts access in this country? That's what I'm wondering. The impact of the NEA is undeniable. We went through those facts, we went through those numbers. And on one hand, like, yes, I think diminishing arts institutions in many ways stops avenues for artists to work. It stops opportunities for artists to get paid, and it does really badly affect full-time artists and admins who get these benefits from the NEA. But I'm left wondering, what percentage of working artists is that? How many artists are actually having their basic needs and finances secured by our artistic institutions? How many artists really get to say that they get paid a reasonable hourly wage or a full-time salary for their full-time work? How many artists can actually pay all of their bills and sustain their cost of living from gigs at these artistic institutions? Art was already underfunded before this happened. It was underinvested in, and that's before all this news and NEA updates in this administration. And the funding models and institutions were already failing. That's really well documented. We know this. So how much of a loss is it if we lose our artistic institutions, our nonprofit theaters? Is art going to stop? Does it really fuck up arts access? I think it does in some ways, but really, there are still so many people who don't get access to art and artistic processes. It was already pretty exclusive. Not that that access is bad or that all institutions are doing bad work or that all NEA funded projects only serve, quote, cultural elites. I'm not saying that. But I am really deeply wondering, what do we do to make our art, to make it radical and innovative and urgent and deeply accessible without institutional support? Can we imagine that? What happens if we're forced to try? How are we going to stand up for the art form, for generations of artists that are behind us? How are we going to make sure that we come back from this pushback with a stronger, more equitable, more nuanced, and complex structure of how to integrate art and theater into our relationships and our communities? If I spin this really scary news and I try and kind of clear the doom scrolling from my brain and infuse it with just a little bit of hope and a little bit of possibility and agency, it makes me wonder, are we being forced to reimagine how we fund and make artistic work happen in a new way? And is that really a bad thing? Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. If you want to send us any feedback, we'd always love to hear from you. Our email is theaterequityrevolution@gmail.com. Stay tuned for some more current events and ways to participate as artist activists in our shared social responsibility.